point that I want to make is that when I look back at the discussion and the debate, there were always a small number of conservatives who raised questions about the direction of travel of education. There are always a small handful of individuals who really hated the idea that the beauty of Western culture was being rendered banal in the way that it was being thought, and the way in which, for example, in the United States, the teaching of history was replaced by social studies and civics. There were always criticisms by a small number of people. But the truth is, and this is the bitter truth, is that for almost a century, the conservative movement, if you can want to call that a movement, in Europe, in America and elsewhere, did nothing but look at their shoelaces, occasionally complain, and then ask the question, oh, teachers are not like what they used to be when I was young. That was like the standard complaint. Oh, guess what? The teachers today are not like the great teachers of 50 or 60 years ago, but they did nothing. The only thing that they did was pass these, they call them reforms. And I know that whenever anybody uses the word reform in relation to education, you really feel like shooting them. Because every reform that's ever been introduced, either with a capital R or a small r, actually made the situation even worse than it already was. So I think that we have to realize that the trouble that we're in, and we are in big trouble, is to some extent our own fault. It's our own complacency, and in many cases, our own cowardice. I don't agree with the fact that if you're a conservative, you cannot go into a school in America, and that you'd be so uncomfortable about what the American high school system is like, that you would feel like a Jewish person after Kristallnacht in a school in Berlin. That's not exactly the way these things are. I remember many, many times going to Washington and talking at the American Enterprise Institute, which is meant to be a conservative think tank. And afterwards, when I gave my usual speech, people come up to me and say, you know, Frank, how could you be a university professor? It's so difficult being a university professor. You're so unpopular. You know, everybody's left-wing in the university. How could you do that? And I said, well, what are you talking about? You got a doctorate. You used to teach in a university. What's happened to you? And basically what he said, the answer is, I feel much more comfortable sitting in the American Enterprise Institute with people who think just like I do, who are sheltered from real life, who don't have to face the pressure, the everyday pressure that normal parents have to face because of the bad subjects that their kids are subjected to. And that kind of refuge of looking for safe spaces for conservatives seems to be a continuous recurring theme that exists all the time. So what I want to argue is that we don't need to find safe spaces. We don't need to find refuge. We have to understand that what we're talking about here in relation to classical education is the truth. And if it's really the truth, then it's well worth fighting for. It's well worth taking seriously and well worth pursuing, despite the fact that we're faced against formidable enemies everywhere, by the way. Not everywhere, not just simply in Poland, not just simply in England or in America. I cannot think of a single country where our thoughts, our way of life, is not under constant pressure and constant threat. And what do? I remember I wrote a book called Wasted, Why Education Isn't Educating, and I gave a talk about it in Amsterdam. And there were about 500 of these teachers there, and many of them were shocked by what I had to say, and I felt that if they could, they would lynch me, you know, sort of, at least metaphorically. But afterwards, about 15 teachers, they happened to be all women in their 40s, came up to me. At first, I thought it was because I was a good-looking guy, and I was getting a bit of action there, but that wasn't what it was. That really wasn't what it was. What it was that they basically said, you know, Frank, we totally agree with what you said, and we do what you said should be done. We call ourselves subversive teachers. That's how they regarded themselves. Their job was to subvert the curriculum and the educational, sort of ethos that existed within Holland. And they were giving me really positive stories about actually what you could do. So what I'm really saying is that if we understand the importance of the ideals we stand for, then we can go out and do our best to subvert the system, but in particular, follow the example. I think it was Janusz who earlier on was talking about the Jesuits. Now, I'm not a Jesuit or anything like that, but I think there's a lot of truth in that somewhere along the line, you do have to go out and you do have to kind of initiate a counter-revolution in education. Right? I wasn't going to use the word counter-reform, because there is no reform that you can be counter against at the moment. And we can do that by setting up schools, by setting up formal and informal structures within which we try to educate young people. We could do that by our writing, by our critique of the stupidity that's being taught within the classroom. We can use the media, not just the formal legacy media, but the social media. I think there's a lot we can do to change the situation, because I think that once one of us or one institution begins to gain traction, then you can set in motion something that is already there in potential, which is that a lot of parents, a lot of ordinary people understand exactly what we're saying. You know, there are millions of European people who are worried about what the kids are learning in school. There are millions of European people that are looking for something a bit more inspiring, a bit more their way of life in terms of education than is the case at the moment. A lot of people actually love their tradition. They love where they come from. They want teachers to affirm that. They want teachers to validate that. And we got to basically create a situation where we can give voice to people who at the moment are a little bit intimidated to say those kinds of things. This is, I think, really quite important that we kind of go down that road. And I think that there are signs that this can be done. I used to be very pessimistic, believe it or not. Not for long, but now and again very pessimistic. In my last year at the university, when I realized that there was only 3 of us in the whole university who had brain cells and who basically were able to stand up to the different kind of pressures. But then, and this is not a cheap advertisement, I came across MCC. And I think that, you can say many things about this organization. Okay, it's not composed of angels. It's not the best organization that you can possibly imagine. But it is the only organization I know that is actually doing what we in general should be doing, which is really educating young people in a way that is a model to everybody else. And I say this not because I work for them. I work for them because that is exactly what they're doing. I think one of the most important things that MCC is doing, and they realize this almost intuitively, is that we need to create an alternative elite, an alternative intelligentsia. We need to construct a body of individuals, of smart students, who are able to fight against the stream. And when I look around the kids that are part of this whole project, and there are thousands of them, I really feel inspired. It's almost like feeling young again. And when at my age you feel young again, I want more of that, as much as possible. So what I'm really trying to say is that in many countries all over the world, there's no reason why that model cannot be used in their own way. I don't expect Italian people to do exactly what Hungarians do, or French people to do what Hungarians do, but they must find their own way. They must find their own road towards a situation where we can bring real enlightenment, where we can, in a sense, rescue the culture of the West in a way that it needs to be through education. I always think back of those historical moments where you have a bunch of monks in an island of Ireland, and they are keeping the faith, they're keeping the reading, they're keeping the culture alive. And in a sense, whether we like it or not, that is our responsibility. And we talked a lot about responsibility today. And I hope you go away and not just rhetorically talk about responsibility, but understand that this is something that we got to live. This is something that we got to use as an example so that we can inspire all the young people that are around us. Thank you for coming, and we're going to have a lot more discussions on education.